Well, welcome back. Yesterday we left off talking about how that when we come to Christ, it makes us look different in the eyes of other people. And those differences can cause conflicts, but they can also be the thing that God uses to open people's eyes. I know one of the first things my brother noticed about me was that I was not nearly as angry or reactive as I had been before I had become a Christian. I mean, I had went from this really wanton life, and then I got into Eastern mysticism, and I didn't find any hope there at all. And then finally, when I met Christ, wow, it just like changed everything. It was like you could feel the hostility and anxiety and all that stress leaving you. And there was peace on the inside, which I had never known in my entire life. And that's why, at the same time, I started making different decisions. I started living my life in a different way. I started saying, people, why don't we get together and go to the park and read the Bible together? I know they must have thought, you are really weird, but I started carrying a Bible. I started reading the Bible. I started talking about the Bible. And honestly, some of those people stopped being my friend after that, and I've never had contact with them since, as far as I know. But there were other people who met the same Savior, and they became a community of believers that we began to grow together. And that's why in verse 4 of chapter 4, Peter continues this conversation by saying, they're surprised, speaking of the culture around you, friends, family, and others who aren't Christian, they're surprised that you don't join them in their reckless, wild living, and they heap abuse on you. It's interesting. The word surprised here, it's a Greek word, seinizo, and it means to be astonished at the strangeness or the novelty of a thing. I love that idea. They're just kind of like, what's going on with you? This doesn't make sense. What's taking place? And I remember going to see an old girlfriend of mine to share this change of life I had. I took a buddy with me because I didn't want to go alone. And I remember going over to her house and sitting down with her, and she was surprised to see me. And then I began to share about how I'd given my life to Christ, and Christ changed my life, and all this sort of stuff, because I felt I needed to go to everybody I know and let them know that Jesus had made a difference in my life. I think I owe a lot of them apologies. And I remember she looked at me and said, you're different. You're not a phony anymore. I thought to myself, I was a little embarrassed by that. I thought, she could tell how phony I was before, but she said, you're not a phony anymore. You're genuine. You're a real person. And that was the thing. She was surprised. She couldn't put this together, what had taken place. And I think that that's what happens when God really gets a hold of our lives. There's a surprise that people have, and it's not always a complimentary surprise, but they recognize that you have something different going on inside of your life. And you see, for them, it doesn't make sense because they have no hope for eternity. It's interesting because Paul makes that statement in 1 Corinthians 15:32, where he says that people are saying, let us eat, drink, for tomorrow we die. And then Paul goes on to say, don't be misled. Bad company corrupts good character. And then he says, come back to your senses as you ought and stop sinning, for there are some who are ignorant of God, and I say this to your shame. Well, this statement, let us eat, drink, and for tomorrow we die, is really first uttered by Solomon in Ecclesiastes. We're talking about 1000 BC, where he said in the book of Ecclesiastes, when he's looking at life and trying to understand it through the lens of time, not eternity, but just simply through the lens of time, he says, then I commended mirth, because a man has nothing better under the sun than to eat, to drink, and to be merry. And so later on, this is also quoted by Isaiah, who said that the judgment of God is going to fall upon Judah and the men of Judah, because that was really the mantra that they used. Basically, live as fast and hard and make a good-looking corpse. And, the thing was, but what we're finding that Peter is saying to us is saying, this makes sense if you don't have a hope of eternal life. But then he goes on in verse 5 and he adds, but they will have to give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. So he says the problem with many people is they can't see anything after what we would call physical death. To them, death at the very best will be simply annihilation. They'll just evaporate and become nothing. At the very worst, there's something waiting them on the other end where they're going to have to give account for what they've done. And that's why you find people are so earnest to try to really minimalize their own bad behavior. why people don't want you talking about sin. They don't want you to talk about right and wrong or good or evil. In fact, they may try to even whitewash it. I just shared in my church a video that this Presbyterian pastorix, she called herself, put basically from her sermon, saying basically that abortion was a sacred thing and that Jesus would be helping women get abortions if he were walking the earth today. And, of course, most people in the congregation were flabbergasted that anybody in their right mind would make that statement. But like the prodigal son, she hasn't come to her senses. This is a woman who is a professional pastor within the Presbyterian denomination, but she's not a Christian. She doesn't know Jesus because you couldn't possibly know Jesus and say something so blasphemously wrong about Jesus. And yet that becomes the whole point, that before we're saved, we don't know any better. And that's where I think you just have to show a little compassion, I guess, a little understanding, because it's trying to describe colors to somebody who's never had sight, or sound to somebody who's never heard, or like the taste of an apple to somebody who's never even seen or tasted an apple. These are things that are sensual experiences, and if you haven't experienced them, then they might as well not exist because you have no metric by which to measure what that means. And the same thing is true. Before I came, I was lost. God found me. I was blind. God gave me sight. I was in death. I was dying, because in reality, from the moment you're born, the next end of the story is always going to be death, sooner or later. That's all I had to look at, all I had to measure life by, and that's where non-Christians are at. And so when we communicate with them, the fact is that we want to understand where they're at, and we don't want to mock or belittle their ignorance or even their opposition. Because as it says, it's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of a living God. It's so fearful that before I was a Christian, I didn't want to believe there was a living God, and I certainly didn't want to think about the prospects of me falling into his hands. And so it was easy for me to rationalize God out of my conversations. And, if he's there, it doesn't matter because I can't know him and I can't connect him. And if he's there, he's this way and that way. And he always ended up being somebody a lot like myself. And that's why I thought God and I would get along really well. And what a shock it was when I met the real God and I discovered that my life was destined for eternal darkness, but God so loved me that he saved me by believing in his son, Jesus Christ. And that's kind of, I think, a heart that we have to have for the non-Christian. It's easy to despise them because oftentimes they do despicable things. And it's easy to look down on them, especially when they're looking down on you. It's easy to want them to get justice when they are treating you unjustly. It's easy to want to have them feel the harshness of God when you felt the harshness of their hands or their behavior. But there's something awaiting them that's so much more terrifying and horrible that as I began to really process in my own heart, my own life, I began to find myself feeling extremely sorry and worrisome even for people who don't know Christ, people that I know in my life who don't know Christ. And I know that there's something awaiting them. And that doesn't make some of those people necessarily safe people. And I get that dynamic because sometimes we foolishly say, well, they're not safe, but I'm just going to put myself out there and see what happens. Granted, if you're taken captive and there's nothing you can do about it, that's one thing, just grin and bear it. But we don't intentionally put ourselves into harm's way. That's one of the things I like to point out about the book of Acts, that when persecution fell on the church, what most of the church in Jerusalem did? They left town. Peter left town. People just got away from it because God isn't calling us to put ourselves in harm's way. He's saying, but when you find yourself in harm's way, then put your trust in God, because there's really no other thing that you can do. And I don't mean that as a last resort, but I'm just simply saying that's oftentimes where God shows up the largest and the most in charge, is when you have no capacity to take control of your situation. And so it's really important for us. On the one hand, we want to be understanding, we want to be compassionate, we want to be patient people, and especially in our conversations with them. Because as somebody once told me, I thought was really good, they said, we often expect people to come to church, listen to a 40-minute sermon, and then change the entire trajectory of the last 40 years of their life. It's not even reasonable to expect that. In fact, every person I've ever known who's come to Christ can begin to relate a series of encounters in their life that led them step by step to that moment where they said, I surrender. I surrender. But we have to always keep in mind that there is waiting for them, if they don't know Christ, an accountability that you don't want them to experience. No matter how mad you are, angry or hurt or offended you are by them, you do not want them to have that experience, because it's more horrific than anything you and I can even describe. Well, again, out of time. Look forward to continuing the conversation tomorrow. God bless you. Go in his grace.